And 4, a look at which papers have been saying what in What the Papers Say.
This week, What the Papers Say is presented by Margaret Van Hattem of the Financial Times.
Good evening. It's been another one of those weeks for the government, the sort of week which in Fleet Street automatically triggers off the phrase banana skin. George Gale in the Express on Friday worked the theme into a symphony.
10 banana skins for Maggie. Since the election, the Prime Minister's path has certainly been strewn with bananas.
The latest was the Prime Minister's failure to rescue her Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, from being overrun by the leftist thug Dennis Healey. But this was only the most recent of a series of gifts to Fleet Street. Gale's conclusion:
To skid on 1 banana skin may be regarded as a misfortune. To skid on 10 is beginning to look like carelessness.
Cartoonist Austin in the Mail on Sunday,
It's a banana skin republic.
and Trog in the Observer
He's treating us like a banana skin republic?
had the same happy thought. But the Grenada crisis threw right-wing papers into confusion. They were obviously itching to bash the government, but couldn't quite bring themselves to attack Mrs. Thatcher. Gale's Washington colleague on the Express was Marx or Castro as the real villain.
Castro, the non-stop menace.
How the Cuban leader has spread his tentacles around the world.
And gave what he called an alarmingly impressive list of troublemaking, including Castro's effect on women. He quotes Margaret Trudeau, former wife of the Canadian Prime Minister, on a close encounter.
I was immediately mesmerized by what I saw. A tall man with incredibly beautiful eyes and a wild, almost fanatical look which made him very attractive.
Mark points out that the book this comes from is called Beyond Reason.
In a heavily accented voice, deep and gruff, he purred out a stream of romantic and flowery English.
No wonder the Americans felt impelled to rescue Grenada from the Cubans. Paul Johnson in the Mail on Sunday got stuck into that favourite pincushion of the right wing,
The Foreign Office doesn't deserve a third chance.
insisting it was all the Foreign Office's fault that Mrs. Thatcher looked ill-informed, indecisive, even ridiculous, as he felt she had during the Falklands crisis.
The reason in both cases is the same. The grotesque incompetence and incorrigible complacency of the Foreign Office.
The Express's James Macmillan warned Mrs. Thatcher,
So long as she trusts her own instincts and keeps away from Foreign Office briefs, she will almost always get the right answer for Britain and British interests. We can ask no more.
The Mail felt President Reagan had been,
Both impressive and persuasive.
and reserved its scorn for,
The incorrigible dithers who would never take decisive action until too late.
and even worse.
Those who are paralyzed by fear of world opinion.
Surely the Mail cannot have meant Mrs. Thatcher? No, surely not. Anyway, the leader writers must have had a good weekend, for by Monday they were conceding that Mrs. Thatcher's case for disagreeing with President Reagan was,
An honourable argument.
though less convincing than...
The joy of ordinary Grenadians at being freed from the tyranny of a bunch of gun-toting Marxists.
Well, now, that depends on how easily you're convinced. Even within one newspaper, there can be two views.
The islanders are jubilant about the U.S. intervention in Grenada.
According to Christopher Thomas. But on the very same page, we learn from Trevor Fishlock,
People are relieved, not jubilant.
but let it pass. The Sun, which doesn't like criticising Mrs. Thatcher any more than the Express and the Mail do, got around the problem even more neatly.
Facts, please.
A week after the crisis erupted in Grenada, we still do not know the facts about the role of the British government.
And it listed 4 questions, paving the way for a triumphant flourish the very next day.
The Sun gets truth out of FO.
Foreign Office officials yesterday answered 4 key questions posed by the Sun about the Grenada invasion.
Never mind that the answers had already been put on the record, mainly by Sir Geoffrey Howe in the Commons 2 days earlier. The Times suggested the Americans had done the right thing, and Sir Geoffrey suffered from...
British pique that the Governor-General's appeal for assistance was made ultimately to the United States and not to Britain.
It's odd how whenever the right-wing press is pleased with the government, it mentions Mrs. Thatcher, and whenever it's displeased, it's Sir Geoffrey what gets the blame. Fleet Street's agonising struggle to support the Americans without criticising Mrs. Thatcher found no echoes across the Atlantic. Here's the New York Times.
A threat in Grenada?
None has been demonstrated.
While the Minneapolis Star and Tribune commented acidly,
President Reagan has shown that the tiny nation of Grenada cannot push the U.S. around.
the New York Times also criticised the way the public was being kept in the dark.
A cloak of secrecy has been thrown over the operation. No reporters allowed in, no credible facts produced about the supposed threat to the Americans on the island.
British reporters did at least get in, but that wasn't the end of their problems, like the Observer's Hugh O'Shaughnessy, who got there in a 12-foot boat.
As we passed the villages of Victoria and Guave, we began to hear the explosions.
U.S. Air Force jets and helicopters began to circle the craft and...
The sharks which were following us made the water seem as menacing as the land and the air clearly were.
On land, things were less like Jaws, and a lot more like a latter-day Western.
The St. George's Harbour was deathly still under the noonday sun as we entered. Not a thing moved on the water. No one stood on the quay. Not a soul moved in the street.
Then, action.
As we clambered ashore, a U.S. fighter screamed into strafe Grenadian positions, only to be met with a machine gun which opened up 100 yards along the quay. We took what cover we could on the waterside.
The Mail's William Langley did even better.
Getting into Grenada was no easy matter, and at times it seemed I would never make it.
For him, it was a 70-mile trip in a 22-foot open fishing boat skippered by a reputed drug smuggler who stopped 4 miles from the coast and said,
That's it. You get out here. I'm going back.
Pleas were useless, Langley continues.
Finally, when we could see the surf breaking 6 feet high, Wadey
He's the drug smuggler.
dumped the dinghy overboard and said,
No further.
we bundled in with cameras and bags and began paddling.
Langley reports how he crash-landed on a narrow beach in front of a sheer cliff.
We found a path up the cliff and stumbled through about 2 miles of bush and scrub before coming onto a road.
The intrepid hacks battled on and finally met a real live Grenadian who welcomed them with the news.
There is no petrol, no water, and no food.
War is hell. Which brings me to Cruise. It's funny how all our cartoonists seem to think of women when drawing missiles. The star's Noel Ford.
Do you really think these women are going to believe we're only delivering stuff for the base bonfire party?
Cookson in The Sun took a similar view.
It's all right, Bello. It's only a new carpet for the officers' mess.
But Garland at the Telegraph saw other possibilities. Cannot think why. That brings to mind a real scoop in the Express.
The amazing petrol pump swindle.
A major express investigation.
The Daily Express today uncovers an astonishing swindle. A radio gadget that fills petrol tanks at 40 pence a gallon by sending garage pumps haywire.
The story, spread all over pages 1, 2, and 3, got the full Woodward-Bernstein treatment, right down to the first contact with Deep Throat, who phoned the paper's Fleet Street office.
My name's Bert,
said the voice.
Are you interested in a story about a gadget that can get you cheap petrol?
The Express assumed its readers were, but took a firm line.
Now is the time for tough action.
And a responsible attitude.
The Daily Express is, of course, withholding the essential details which would enable crooks to cash in.
Of course. Here are the non-essential details, which the Express published fully on the next page.
The burner is readily available in Britain. The easiest place to buy it is from CB suppliers. The local directory gave me the name of the nearest CB shop, City CB Centre in Pitfield Street, London. The owner was delighted.
I expect he was.
Delighted to sell me the Italian-made Zitagi B300 PS for £95.
And here's the best news.
Anybody can fit the system to a car if they can fit a radio, and the unit can be switched on at the push of the cigarette lighter in the dashboard.
Still, it was a scoop, and the gnashing of teeth could be heard all over Fleet Street. But there were banana skins ahead for the Express. On Monday, the Express had another big exclusive.
Anne Parkinson in sea rescue drama.
Near tragedy rocks ex-minister and family on holiday.
William Hickey, exclusive.
It seems that Mrs. Parkinson, on holiday in Portugal with her husband, had gone for a swim. On failing to persuade 2 Portuguese schoolboys that she was not in difficulties, she'd been forced to swim back to shore. But Mrs. Parkinson, according to the Mail,
Told friends that she was astonished by the story in the Daily Express.
There were a couple of young lads who might have been surprised to see anyone swimming that far out, but I was never in the slightest danger.
a recognized expert in getting back lost property, she
even helped them get their surfboard, which they had lost. I was just having a lot of fun.
The Mail had, meanwhile, noticed another William Hickey exclusive last Friday.
Mistress Sarah makes a return to Westminster.
While Cecil Parkinson is recovering from his political downfall for the golfing holiday, his spurned mistress, Sarah Keyes, stunned MPs by turning up in the House of Commons as Parliament reopened for business this week.
A follow-up item in Peter Hillmore's Pendennis column in The Observer revealed.
Miss Keyes has, in fact, been in Oman on the Arabian Gulf for the past week.
No wonder, then, that MPs were
stunned.
The Mail pounced,
How to offend both the wife and the mistress at the same time.
pointing out the inaccuracy of both Hickey stories. This did not stop the Sun printing a picture exclusive.
Whacked. Pale and exhausted, the wife of disgraced Tory Cecil Parkinson leans heavily on rescuers after a holiday swimming drama. Mrs. Anne Parkinson looked near collapse as she staggered ashore to be met by her frantic husband.
Well, there may be some ambiguity in Mrs. Parkinson's expression, but there is absolutely none in Mr. Parkinson's cheery grin. And if indeed she was near collapse when the picture was taken, I imagine she had something to say when she revived. And incidentally, the Sun's so-called rescuers appeared nowhere in the original Express picture.